So this didactic is getting your work out there, how to get published in medical education research, which is co-sponsored by the research community and the educational research interest group. We have a wonderful group of slated speakers and panelists. If you have questions, feel free to place them in the chat. For sure the speakers will get to them. Dr. Gottlieb, I guess you're starting out.
Thanks, Josh. So the idea behind this is really to talk about how we can be better about getting our work out there. Everything from the step of how do I create a good question and build it into something that is a publishable product to once it's out there, how do I get through the review process? How do I get this published? How do I get this disseminated? So we've assembled this team of amazing experts here. The intention of this is we have questions that we've kind of prepared in advance, but you all have a lot of insights and thoughts, and bring in your questions as you go through there as well. If you throw them in the chat, we're going to integrate them in and ask any and all questions going through that. And also feel free to throw into the chat your ideas and your approaches. As we provide some of our insights and advice, we want to hear about yours as well, because that's the beauty of this great group, is that we can all share things that have worked well and some of our areas that we've learned from. So with that, I thought it'd be good to start off with just introducing the panel and who we have and maybe some of our experience that explains why we're on this panel. And so I can kind of start us off. I'm Mike Gottlieb. I'm an associate professor of emergency medicine. I'm the ultrasound director for the division at Rush in Chicago. I also serve as an editor for Annals of Emergency Medicine, Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training, American Journal of Emergency Medicine, Western Journal of Emergency Medicine, and the social media editor for Academic EM. And so with that, I'm going to pass along next to Susan Promise.
Thanks a lot, Mike. So I'm Susan Promise. I am a professor and chair of emergency medicine. I'm at Penn State Health in Hershey, Pennsylvania. I am on this panel, I think, given my role as the editor-in-chief for Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training. So that journal's been out for a few years now, and I've had the luxury of working with some amazing people as decision editors, all of which are on this panel today. So I'm excited to be able to kind of share the hour with all of you and looking forward to helping you with any questions you might have. And maybe go to Jamie next. What do you say?
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie Jordan. I'm an associate professor and associate program director at UCLA. And as Susan mentioned, I'm also a decision editor at AEM-ENT and a guest decision editor for the WestGem Educational Supplement. And I'm really excited to be here. I'll turn it over to Sally.
Well, I'm Sally Santon. I'm a senior associate dean at Virginia Commonwealth University. And then I'm also a professor of emergency medicine at VCU, as well as University of Cincinnati, which is my new institution. I guess my persona is kind of, I consider myself to be an educational researcher and try to cross the continuum. And then I'm an editor for the journal AEM-ENT, and then I review for a bunch of different journals, but I mostly just do a lot of writing.
Excellent. Again, this amazing panel we have here. And the idea is to get it from people who not only do education research, we sit on the side of authorship, on the side of viewership, and then as editors and editor-in-chief. And so we're trying to get that full spectrum of having both ends of the paper. And so with that, I think one of the first things I'd like to know is how do you actually decide what's a good study question? What's your approach to saying, yeah, this is a project I want to move forward with, or this is a project that isn't the right fit?
I think one of the things I think about first when I'm trying to decide on a study question is just trying to find something that I care about. Something that's important, something that is going to make a meaningful contribution. And then while I'm thinking about those important things, I really try and think about if I can actually get it done. So I'm sure many folks have probably heard of the FINER criteria, which just stands for feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. And I really think that's just a great tool to sort of check against those initial research questions and ideas that you come up with, and really apply those criteria to see if you can sort of refine or tweak your question to really make it the best that it can be.
And I think that point is huge. We just kind of calling back to like what FINER is. So it's, feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, relevant, and running it through. I think oftentimes we hear that, but we're not always so good, or at least I'm not always so good, particularly early on. I wasn't so good about actually going through and saying, yeah, I'm going to run through the FINER and actually see if this is a good study, because I would get really, engulfed in this is interesting to me. And the I would like make this giant I with a really small FNER. And I'd be like, oh, I love this. This is really exciting. I wouldn't take those other steps to say, wait a second. is this feasible in my institution, or is this feasible to do in the first place? Is this so difficult to do? Is this something ethical? Can I actually do this study? It sounds great to say, let's do a randomized controlled trial of assessing the role of an airway intervention for emergency medicine residents. But then if I randomize one group to not get ultrasound training, that's not really ethical for them. So how do we address those ethical issues? And sometimes it's a matter of just, does anyone else care, right? That relevance piece. It may be interesting to me, but if I'm the only person that cares about it, it's really only it's not gonna get published because no one else cares. There's no value in it outside. So I think that running through the finder that Jane mentioned is so huge of how do we actually, ensure that this is something that will not only be interesting to us, but interesting to other people and be a feasible project. So one of the things, once you have your project out there, I know that one of my errors early on was just not thinking about conceptual frameworks. So how should we approach, first of all, what is conceptual framework for those of us who don't know that? And then why does it matter? Why should I be thinking about that in terms of research?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I don't think many people recognize the importance of conceptual framework when they're just getting started in doing medical education research. So for a little bit of background, a conceptual framework is really kind of the way we look at the world. How are we framing the question that we're asking? And borrows a lot from, psychology and people that study how people interact. So George Burdage really kind of brought forward the conceptual framework of kind of looking at things through different lenses. How do we see the world? And it's an important thing to think of as you start an educational research project. I'm going to give you some samples, and I think you'll say, oh yeah, I get what that means. So for example, I think many people know when you're thinking of assessment or clinical competency, Miller's pyramid, right? Knows how, shows, and does. I think you can relate to that. So if you're framing a project related to assessment and clinical competency, that might be the conceptual framework that you're working from. Or maybe you're thinking of an evaluation model, and you might want to think of Kirkpatrick or Moore. So thinking of, is it a learner reaction, or are you actually learning? Are you changing behavior, or are you really having an outcome difference? So those are some examples of conceptual frameworks. I would recommend looking, there's a few resources that could be helpful. Allium has the education theory made practical. We'll put those links in the chat function here in a minute. And IceNet, also, you can go to that website and there's some stuff on education theory. But I'd say the other thing that I'd recommend you do if you're thinking of doing some medical education research and you're new to that is go out and look at the literature, see what frameworks other studies have used so that you can kind of use that as kind of a launching pad for, where you're going with that. I don't know if Sally or Jamie, if you guys have any other suggestions.
I think all of those are good. I think there's also ones that eventually you kind of come up with ones that you use frequently. And so I think I frequently will use kind of a social determination theory, which is a motivation theory. And then I think we all use kind of Miller's and Kirkpatrick and things like that.
Yeah, and I was just going to sort of echo the importance of this, of really deciding and sort of calling out your conceptual framework from the beginning, because that's really going to inform all the other important aspects of your study, your design, your variables, your outcomes, everything.
Yeah, I think that's, and especially medical education, it's almost become the standard that you would expect, either within the introduction discussion, sometimes both, to have the conceptual framework that basically informs some of this too, like the why. Right? We did the study. Here's the why. Here's the theoretical underpinning and the psychological underpinning to explain why this happens. And I would say that, as a reviewer and editor, I kind of start to expect that. So that often comes up as one of the comments amongst there of what we can improve upon with our paper to try to give that theoretical underpinning of it. That said, the conceptual frameworks can be a little overwhelming in the beginning, especially if you're not as familiar with them. So that's why I threw a couple of them on the chat. I'll add some more as we go along to help just kind of start to identify them. There is no perfect conceptual framework. That was something that for me early on was a little challenging, is which one do I choose? And there's more than one. There's not always a perfect one. There's probably a couple really, really good ones, and there might be one that might be potentially the best, but there's other ones that still fit there. And so being okay with the fact that there's other ones that might fit into there, and just choosing the one that seems to best align with yours. And if there's a better one, the reviewers will let you know. So with that kind of in mind, let's talk more about the studies. So I have a study, and I'm trying to think about how do I best perform it? Like when you're approaching a topic, like, well, maybe we'll kind of throw out there imposter syndrome. So if I'm trying to approach a topic like imposter syndrome, I can imagine a ton of different ways to get there. So how do you decide, like, what study designs do you think about, and what are maybe some of the pros and cons? How do you start to filter through what's a better study designer for a specific project?
So Jamie and I are going to take on imposter syndrome and kind of bounce back and forth about different methodologies, different ways in which we might approach it, and think about kind of advantages and disadvantages to each of them. And so I think if I were kind of doing imposter syndrome, I might actually start with a survey. So Jamie, let's start with a survey. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think this whole question of design, you really need to think about what your research question is and what your conceptual framework is, and that's going to help you pick a design that's going to be aligned with those two things. So I think if I was thinking about a survey, so surveys are really great for getting like large sample data on human phenomena such as like attitudes or opinions or personal facts, right? Things that people can appropriately answer. So if I was thinking about imposter syndrome, then I might think about some questions like, what are the demographic characteristics of physicians suffering from imposter syndrome? Or even like, what is the prevalence of imposter syndrome among emergency medicine residents? And I think we could design a survey that way. Now, I think Sally will probably mention some other highlights, but surveys aren't perfect, right? And there's going to be a lot of pros and cons that you'll have to sort of weigh the benefits and downsides against. I think one of the nice things is they're pretty easy to distribute. It's easy to reach a large number of participants. I think you need to consider your response rates, and if you're going to be able to get an appropriate response rate for the thing that you're trying to look for. I think the other biggest challenge, at least for me and what I've encountered in terms of developing surveys, just making sure that you're gathering enough validity evidence to support the use of that survey. And I think that's something that we often take for granted. At least I certainly took for granted, especially when I was starting out. But that's going to be really, really important.
I'm just going to kind of reiterate a couple of things. I think ideally, if you're doing a survey, use somebody else's survey that has previous validity evidence. In general, surveys are not valid per se. They have validity evidence on the population that they do. And for example, if you've done an imposter syndrome on CEOs, survey on CEOs of businesses, that may or may not apply to emergency medicine. And so you want to think again about collecting evidence that it has validity in that population. But the best you can do is to choose a survey that's already been out there and then just collect some of the validity evidence along with it. If you can't, if there isn't an instrument, let's say we really want to know about imposter syndrome in trauma team resuscitation, right? And you want to kind of get a sense of what that is, then there are some very specific steps that you want to do when you're trying to create that survey. And so you would look at a survey design paper and you would follow those steps to make sure that you're collecting your validity evidence. I mean, I think the other thing that Jamie said, which is just key, is the sample size, right? So if I decide I want to know the frequency of imposter syndrome in emergency medicine physicians, so I decide to send it out to the cord listserv, you have no idea what the denominator is, right? That's going to God knows how many people. And so you don't really know. Most likely there's going to be response bias. Those who are interested in imposter syndrome are going to take your little survey. And those who aren't interested are going to be like, oh, this is garbage. And they're not going to do it. Right. And so the response rate is really, really critical. Is that you got to try to get to that 70% response rate if you're trying to do something meaningful in emergency medicine. Other thoughts on that, Jamie or Mike or Susan?
I think you hit on a lot of really amazing points there. The validity evidence, we often say, is a validated survey, but it's really only valid for the population you're assessing. So even if it was validated for the last group, you still are adding it to a new group, so it's not really valid anymore. It's just trying to avoid reinventing the wheel. Using a survey that's already been done before is a much stronger survey than having to create one from scratch. And at least has some validity evidence in there, even if it's not totally validated for this group. One of the other things that I think you hit on that was a really key point was this response rate and then non-respondent bias. So there's this response rate and like how many people answer it, but sometimes surveys, we just don't get good enough response rates. Sometimes you do a survey and because the population is so hard to capture, or the survey, there's something about it that just makes it more challenging. is that we may only capture like 50 or 40% below that magic 60 to 70% that everyone loves. Like you may be a little below there, but you can still salvage that if you can prove that this capture rate is reflective of the broader population. And so you might do things like, if it's among residencies, you might say, is it have a mix of 3 and 4 year programs? Is it spread across the United States? Does it have, a mix of county and academic and community programs? So you can assess that piece. And then the other thing that's worth keeping in mind is that you can do kind of a wave analysis, which basically means you compare the first group and then those who get who do the response after a couple of reminders. And if they're relatively similar, it provides a little more evidence that the groups are relatively stable, that you're less likely to have picked up something new in the new response.
Cool.
All right,
so go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was moving on to retrospective. So let's say you got this great survey of imposter syndrome and you've done it on all of your residents and you've got an existing instrument and you know, wow, who's an imposter and who's not an imposter based on whatever instrument that you have reconfirmed their validity evidence. So then you want to kind of say, well, how is that related to other things? And so a retrospective survey might be a good way to do that. You might want to say, do people with imposter syndrome submit more patient safety reports because they're uncertain about what they do? Do they do fewer intubations because they're afraid to intubate? Do they, what are some of the consequences of what you do? And it's not really consequential because in fact, you're going retrospective, but you can use some sort of existing data to go back and say, what is this associated with? And so you might associate it with, again, performance, like we talked about, clinical performance. You might associate it with, I don't know, in-service training exams. Did they improve because they don't have imposter syndrome? But you can go back and look at things retrospectively based on having an existing data set. There's advantages to this. One is if you de-identify it, the IRB says exempt or maybe even not research, and so that's nice. It's less work if you can collect data retrospectively because you're not having to prospectively redo it. You do get into some issues perhaps in terms of consent, because if you're getting stuff retrospectively, you don't have consent, and so you may need to do some sort of a de-identification process. Other things that are difficult or problematic with it is that you can't actually control what you wanted to do, and so you might not be able to do like the number of intubation attempts, or you might not even have data that says the number of intubations that they did. Is that retrospective data, because it is not intentionally collected, has some limitations in terms of what you might find in that data set. But a retrospective study is a great way to kind of look at things in associations, not truly consequences or cause and effect because it's looking backwards, but it can help you kind of with associations with whatever thing you're interested in.
Yeah, I just want to kind of echo the importance of considering that downside about the quality of the data as to what you're actually looking for is really something that you need to consider, because you might have to deal with, inaccurate information, missing information, and you can't do anything about it at that point because it's already been done, right? So I think that's a really important point that Sally made.
Do we want to stop and answer the survey question, or do you want to wait till the end?
No, I think it's a great opportunity to ask the question. So Josh Gutman put together a question. He said, for surveys related to COVID, since there's no previously validated surveys on COVID, as editors, does that change the way you look at those studies when you're considering publication?
So I'll jump on that one. So I think if you're trying to look at something like, somebody recently was talking about moral injury in relationship to COVID. If you're trying to look at something that is a pre-existing construct, you use the instruments from those studies. And so if you're trying to say well-being, burnout, self-efficacy, fulfillment, all of those things have pre-existing instruments. And so you would use those. You may alter them a little bit to align with COVID, but for the most part, you can often find something that is aligned with what you're doing. If you're doing something completely different, like, I think our fear around, the valid fear around PPE, right? Then if you're creating new instruments, then you really need to, go through the steps of creating validity evidence, of content validity, response process, internal structure. There's a whole set of these very intentional steps that you go through that you're doing when you're creating your own instrument.
And I'll throw a link in the chat as well to a really great primer on how to assess the contact validity, the response process validity, and then the inter-item or the reliability aspect of things. All right, so we talked about retrospective. How about prospective?
Yeah, so prospective ones are easier to do kind of moving forward. Um, in terms of you're collecting data and then you're moving forward with that, right? And so it might be something like, I want to do an intervention that is going to change the imposter syndrome of my female residents, or I want to do an intervention that is going to improve their ability to step up and run resuscitations. And so in those situations, you can do it either, that you're doing an intervention and you can randomize to control or not control, or you can simply do an intervention and follow them as a cohort, but you're moving forward. The advantages of that one is that you can truly collect information, the appropriate stuff that you're looking for, and you can get closer to causal relationships. It's not always going to be completely causal, but it gets you to a better sense of how things are related and how they are related. Jamie, can you add some more about kind of prospective ones?
I was just going to say that, yeah, I mean, I think the difference is having randomized groups and having non-randomized groups, which is a big thing, I think, in education research, just from an ethical perspective, right? Is we often find that we have the ethical challenge of randomizing groups. I'll just throw out there one option that you can consider if you're trying to navigate that, but you still want to use randomized groups, would just be to offer the intervention to the initial control group after the study's concluded. And that might be a way around the ethical dilemma of having the groups have two different experiences. That way everyone will get the same opportunities. They'll just be at different times, and you'll be able to have a really robust study.
I think the other thing to say is that unless things are truly proven, not everybody is entitled to them. And so you can also often argue it in that way, in terms of, we don't know if better resuscitation is going to be done by running through an imposter thing, or maybe they do team training and you compare them head to head. But it's important to, as you do randomized pieces, to recognize that something is better than nothing. And so if you're going to truly randomize them, you should probably not randomize them to control, because just proving to somebody that, yes, doing a session on imposter syndrome made them better, then something gets to something. And so if you're going to put that much effort into it, just be really careful about your design and consult somebody who's done a lot of research.
Yeah, I think that's such a key aspect of that, the ethical component of it, and how do you ensure everyone ends up at the same level of training, but also that avoiding that N+1 model where, just giving some training, people are gonna like it. People are gonna learn more because they were compared to nothing, right? By the mere nature of us talking through anything, there's something that's happening, you're learning this. So we already teach people, it's more, now it becomes more a matter of which one's better. So I think just keeping that piece in mind. And so we've been talking through a lot of, I think, some of what was, my vision of research, at least when I was a resident, was there's surveys, there's these prospective models, there's retrospectives, and then qualitative kind of hit the scene. And it's been around for a long time, but it's been increasingly utilized within medical education. And I think that the rigorous kind of brought it up, and I think just the level of expectation of what qualitative is has risen. So maybe we could talk a little bit about like what qualitative is and maybe how you might utilize this.
I'll start with that one. Yeah, I mean, I love qualitative research, and it's also something that I kind of came to later and did primarily quantitative work previously. But I think it's really great for getting that really rich contextual details. So like if we were going to go back to like our example of imposter syndrome, like if you wanted to know more about how imposter syndrome affects the lives of physicians suffering from it, then that would be a great opportunity to do a qualitative study. And there's a lot of different ways to go about it, depending, again, on your research question and your study aims. I think the big thing to think about is these really should be sort of how and why questions. And in terms of differences that you should probably consider, qualitative will be very time consuming. You'll be looking at smaller sample sizes because they're going to be much more in depth. And then the whole process to analysis is going to be different, right? You're no longer dealing with numbers and precise measurements. You're dealing with words or texts or objects or observations. And so the way that you actually go about analyzing that data is going to be very different from what you've experienced with quantitative work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was, and qualitative is such a dense thing that we could pretty much do with the entire talk just on qualitative, on how to do this and the nuances of this. And so for those who are interested in learning more, we can definitely, you can kind of reach out just so we can expand on that. That said, so we've covered retrospective, prospective, we've talked about qualitative, we talked about surveys. Are there any other research designs we're missing?
So I think there's a debate as to this one, but if you're doing some sort of an innovation or curriculum change, you can have that be educational research. I think there can sometimes be debate about that, but essentially, if you're trying something new, you want to kind of prove that what you have done is effective, and that itself can sometimes be a publication if done in a straightforward, structured, rigorous manner. And that might be like an innovation report or something. For those, you can often publish, not often, you can publish innovation reports with small sample sizes. So I think my favorite sample size was a paper I got in academic medicine with 5. And I was like, there were just five subjects, and it's probably one of the bigger ones that I have done, the bigger papers in terms of conceptual pieces, but it's purely just an innovation. It's something that we thought we should do. We were looking at resident handovers, or medical student to resident handovers. And so when you're doing something that is completely novel, you can sometimes publish it just as an innovation.
Yeah, I think that point is key, is that we often think of like research must have these vast number of outcomes, but if it's something truly innovative, then your pilot study, if you focus enough on the conceptual framework, how it informs and how this changes how we educate others, this is a very open process that there's a lot of journals, including AMENT, JGME, Academic Medicine, among others, that will publish these innovation reports with fewer samples because the idea is so big or novel or different that the sample itself is less important. And oftentimes you do a follow with another bigger study and then exploring it with more data. All right, so we have these designs out there. So
sorry, can I interrupt you for just 1 second, Mike?
Go ahead, Jamie.
I just want to kind of dovetail on the whole like innovation. Just make sure in terms of actually being successful at publishing innovations report, a lot of these journals that do publish them have a very different format for how you structure an innovation report compared to a research report. So I just want to throw that out there when you're looking to make sure that your paper gets published. Is follow the framework that's specified for the journal for the whatever it is that you're submitting.
Absolutely. I think that's probably a good mantra in general, is follow the author guidelines of the journal. But particularly for things like innovation reports, because they vary, exactly as Jamie said, from how we traditionally might write our introduction, methods, results, discussion model of things. They can vary a little bit for innovations. So that kind of in mind, how do we select our outcomes? Like what's your model saying, okay, here's how I structure outcomes, or here's how I ensure that I'm being thoughtful about what outcomes would be best? How do you approach it?
So in general, I think we look at kind of Miller's assessment triangle, or Miller's pyramid. And so it's going to be things such as did they learn, did they know something? Did they know how to do something? Did they show doing something, or did they do something? I think, let's see, if we're trying to use an example, knows might be something like a multiple choice question, showing that they have understood the knowledge. Knows how might be something procedural that they know that they can apply and analyze and use that at a higher level. Shows how is usually thought for simulation and OSCEs, and then does is what people are doing in performance, is kind of the way that I think about it. And so I would use those outcomes for studies that I was looking at.
Yeah, and keeping with the theme of pyramids and triangles, I'm also a big fan for Kirkpatrick. It's by far not the only model you can use, but it's also just a good framework of thinking through the different levels we can. It helps me sometimes to think about outside the box and not just settle for kind of more lower level outcomes. So if we break down Kirkpatrick, it's got 4 levels. So level 1, kind of this base of the pyramid, is do they like it? And did they like it? And I'm going to spread these out a little bit because I think that sometimes we narrow in a little bit. Did they like it? Shouldn't just refer to the learner. Did the faculty enjoy it? Like, we can think from a program evaluation standpoint, did the faculty enjoy it? What was their, what was their perception of it? What was the learner's perception of the curriculum? What did they feel like they took away? What was the value? And you can sometimes even break it out in terms of what was the time, the modality. You can break these things out a little bit and figure out different pieces of their perception of it. So that's level 1. Level 2 is going to be your knowledge, skills, attitudes. So you're going to say, you could do it with a test assessment of knowledge. You could do it with a skills assessment like SimLab, see if they can actually demonstrate this skill. And then attitudes, which is surprisingly utilized a lot less than the other ones, is are they more likely to do something? Which often feels like it should be like a level 1, but it's not. Do you feel like after this course, you're now more likely to use ultrasound? You're now more likely to, go ahead and use this intervention. So I think being conscious of like those pieces. When we get to level 3, it's our behaviors. So moving beyond attitudes is, did you actually do what you said you were going to do? And so you're looking maybe in a chart review. Did they actually, in the case, I'm an ultrasound guy, so I'm going to focus on that. But did they do more ultrasounds? Were their ultrasounds, higher quality? Are they actually doing this? And then you take it up one final level and you say the systems. And system is, did this actually impact something beyond the learner? So did this impact maybe length of stay? Did it impact the patient care? Did it reduce the, in the case of, again, ultrasound, did it lead to, better care such that there was fewer quality incidents? There was, better outcomes. There was shorter length of stay by using point of care. Did something change at a systems level beyond the intervention? And so I think just as we're going through studies, being kind of thoughtful of, as Sally mentioned, being our Miller's pyramid and our Patrick's pyramid, kind of saying, what are the different outcomes I can get, and trying to catch more than one or two. So Katja Goldheim added a great question, which says, for med ed research, does that still have to be patient outcomes, or is there something else? What do y'all think?
I think that's a really good question. I think, everything we do in medicine really should be about the patient. But at the end of the day, right, we have to take care of the people that care for those patients. So I think it depends on the context of what you're studying, right? If you're developing curriculum to, improve outcomes on patients that present with stroke symptoms, well, you really ought to prove that you made a difference in the care of those patients with stroke symptoms. So I think it really depends on the context, but I think at the end of the day, we're really there for the patient. I don't know what others think.
Yeah, it's hard to follow. I completely agree with you. I think it sometimes feels like the white whale, this level 4 outcome that's so hard to attain. But I think that's what we need to start striving for, because there's tons of studies that say, yeah, they like it because people like being taught and they like new things. But to take it to the next level, does it change knowledge? Does it change their behavior? And particularly, does it impact patients? Because that exactly is, Dr. Promise says, that's what we're here for at the end of the day. All right, so we've talked about these studies. Let's take it a step further and say, how do you approach, actually creating the team? Like, what's your model for identifying a study team? How do you ensure that, you've all been so incredibly productive? So what have been your strategies to actually do that?
I think some of it goes to, picking good team members. I think that's probably first and foremost, is really getting collaborators who are interested, who are going to engage, who are going to contribute, and can, help you learn something and make you better. So I think that's probably one of the first things that I felt was really important, particularly in my early career when I didn't know what in the world I was doing, is really surrounding myself by people who did. I think the other things that have really worked well for me are just, one, making it a priority. I think it really is something that you need to block out time for. Some of this is a little bit of a numbers game, right? If you want to be successful in publishing research, then you need to submit research. And the more you submit, the more likely you are to get published. So I think really blocking out time is important, because usually, at least in my experience, it's been that research sort of falls as the lowest priority on the totem pole of all the things that you need to juggle with your professional careers. But actually blocking out time, sticking to it, I think is going to be really helpful. The other thing that I think just, maybe personally for me, that has really contributed to any small success that I've had in publication is project management skills. Like, I think that's something that I learned to do very well, very early on. And that does sort of come around to building good teams, regularly meeting, setting expectations, setting deadlines, following up for accountability, and really being sort of deliberate and diligent and on task with all of that in order to push the project forward.
Yeah, I think I'd really reiterate the whole project management piece. Like, you've got to develop a timeline or times to check in. Like, it's really important. This group, we were talking about this in another setting, and set your deadlines so you'll have something to strive for, and be realistic. I think it was you, Mike, who said, don't set it 3 months from now, because you'll wait a couple weeks or maybe a few days before that 3 months. Set them a little bit earlier, and maybe you take smaller chunks of work to do in that period of time so you can get it done. Because time doesn't just come up from somewhere. You really have to prioritize it and put it on your calendar and make it a priority for yourself.
Absolutely. I think the deadlines are so huge. One of the other things I've been working on trying to be more conscious of is, getting out of the groove of the same team every time. And so I think we all have our favorite people and the people that you know that you could write great, and the paper will be great. Like you work together, you'll be an amazing team, it'll be highly effective. And that's the same couple of people every time. And I think that does us a disservice as a field because we're not really advancing it. We're not creating future researchers. And so trying to be conscious of like identifying new up and comers or soon to be up and comers and trying to like pull them in so that at least most of my teams now have a mix of more and less experienced people so that we can kind of all learn together and hopefully kind of expand the number of EM education researchers that there are out there. So it's not just the same smaller core group of people that are doing things. And so trying to do that and like pairing up, junior and senior researchers together, I think helps us to really advance our field too. So, all right, so you got your team, we've set our deadlines, the project's coming along. When it comes to actually writing up the paper, what do you feel like are like the key components or maybe the pearls and pitfalls to writing a high quality manuscript?
Yeah, so I'll take this to start if that's okay with the group. So pet peeve of mine is people not following directions. So each journal has its own set of guidelines with respect to manuscript submissions. So take a look at them. Identify, where your manuscript fits. As Sally mentioned, an innovation is going to, or maybe it was Jamie, I can't remember. An innovation is going to be written up a little bit differently than you would original research. And some journals have special headings or topics that you might be able to fit your project into. And so you should know about that ahead of time. The other thing I think is important is, and you may not be aware of some of these things, but there are guidelines and with respect to kind of assessing the quality of, say, for example, a big review, or there are guidelines looking at reporting. How do you report out certain things? And I'll put in the chat here just a second, a few different websites that will kind of help you look at things so you can use these. Let me put this here right now. For example, there's guidelines on, what is the quality of the papers that you're putting in a review that you're doing? Are those, when you put together your meta-analysis, are there good quality papers that are going into that analysis? There's the Newcastle Ottawa scale that you can look at for the quality of non-randomized studies and cohorts that you put in meta-analyses. There's MERSCI, the Medical Education Research Study Quality Instrument, and it looks at methodologic quality for experimental, quasi-experimental, and observational studies. There's Best Evidence in Medical Education to kind of rate the quality of papers. There's guidelines for strengthening how you report out observational studies, the Strobe guidelines. So it has a checklist. And then there's also opportunities to look at the consort guidelines. So there's lots of them out there. And I just don't think everybody knows about them. So it's something to kind of open up your eyes and see what's available. Another great tool is the Equator Network. So enhancing the quality and transparency of health research. So there's many tools out there. You just have to go check them out. But those are, I guess, some of the basic things. I don't want to take up all things because I'm sure others have some to add, but I put those out there for the group to think about and ponder.
Yeah, I think that point is key. I'm a big fan of Equator Network because I know a number of guidelines, but then sometimes if it's a new type of study design, that I might not be aware of it, or maybe a new one that came out there. So Equator Network is this kind of all-encompassing source that collects the vast majority of guidelines that are out there. So if you wanted to do a qualitative study, you don't have to try to memorize what they are. You just go to Equator and type in qualitative, and they'll throw up SRQR, they'll throw up correct, they'll tell you exactly what you need for a given study design. So it takes a lot of the stress out of it, and then you can use that as your double check mechanism to make sure that you have everything done that you need to report it out. This list in the chat, so you just put an incredibly long list of amazing resources. So this is excellent, highly recommend them. A question came up in the chat from Josh Gutman saying, how do you, kind of calling back to the last one, which is how do you go about forming your teams, particularly when you're at other institutions?
So I'm going to take a stab at that, and others people can add on. I think you need to find people that have similar interests. And national meetings are a great place for that. Go and see who's attending certain committee meetings that you're at, or who's got a poster up of something that you're interested in. And, or look to somebody who's doing good work in the area that you like, talk to them, ask them for advice, see if they're willing to partner with you, or if not, maybe they don't have time, but they can suggest other people. I think we have a pretty amazing community in emergency medicine. Like, you just need to reach out to people, and people will help. If they can't do it, most people say, sorry, I'm overwhelmed, or I can't do it right now. Talk to so-and-so and make that virtual introduction for you. So that would be my suggestion. Maybe others have other thoughts.
Yeah, I think there are people who are connectors. And so that can be particularly helpful. I remember talking to Larry Grubbin like years and years ago. I was like, I read this great paper by this person. Could you introduce me to Ole Tenkate? And he's like, oh yeah, really, AAMC, a couple months away, have lunch with him. And I did, and I got to, right? And so you just find the people who are connected. I actually think that Michael and Jamie are actually quite, and Susan, you all are connected. And so if you're looking for somebody, just reach out to somebody who's connected, and they can usually put you in touch with that person. I think the other thing is that when you reach out and they don't answer, it's probably that the email got lost in the basket. And so try one more time, like try twice at least, says the person who loses things in their email. And it doesn't, if I don't respond, it's probably that it just got lost in the email, not that I wasn't particularly interested. And so I think, try to make those contacts to talk to people and bring them in.
Yeah, and I think there's something of like either a snowball or like a web effect, because good people know good people, and emergency medicine is still fairly small, and I think education researchers in emergency medicine is even smaller, but people are generally good about connecting people. I think that's one of the ways that I've sort of expanded my network, is just doing a project with so-and-so who then brings on so-and-so to help, and then that person has another project, and then you introduce you to more people, and it sort of spreads out from there. And I do think, the national meeting thing is a really great opportunity to find those people who are doing similar things. So attending, the poster sessions or the other abstract sessions, like that's been a really good way for me to see what other people are doing in the areas that I'm interested in, and to maybe see if there's opportunities for collaboration with those folks.
I think that falls on us a little bit too, is that, when someone offers a project, if you don't have time to do it, it's a great opportunity to sponsor someone else up. Or even if you do, then maybe it's an opportunity to pull in someone that that you think would connect really well. So sometimes it's us to help bring the people forward and kind of be that connector for someone else. As it comes to the other aspect of, how do you actually run these teams? Because I work mostly nationally, internationally with the vast majority of my collaborators. And I think a few things have worked really well for me. One is just take advantage of digital media. So we're past the days of sending, typing up a draft and sending it in the mail. Like, we can all work on a Google Doc or a Dropbox paper and work together simultaneously and make things way easier. I think the other thing is, if you've never worked with a team before, as much as we're so good at doing things asynchronously, if I've never met someone before, I try to do a Zoom with them to just at least kind of normalize, like, there's a face at the other end of it. We can galvanize our project. Like, people I've worked with on a couple dozen papers are really easy to type and just start going with, because I know them, they know me, like, we work together, we have a sense of their style. But we never worked together before. There's that value of just connecting a little bit to the person underneath it, and like just talking through the project verbally as opposed to totally off a sheet of paper. So it's okay to send, to work a little bit synchronously through video too, just to connect that group and kind of do those initial stages of teaming. So one of the other things I want to get your insights on is editors and reviewers of a number of journals. Is what are some of your pet peeves? Like, when you're looking at the other end, the manuscript comes in, what are you maybe like, what's one or two pet peeves that you wish that, writers knew, so that we could create a stronger paper for you?
I'm going to echo Susan's comment that she made previously, is read the author instructions. I think that's one of my worst pet peeves, is when I see a manuscript come across my desk that's just been formatted either for another journal or didn't follow the very obvious guidelines that are posted on the website. So read the instructions.
I think for me, it's the rigor, right? So did they pay attention to sample size? If they didn't have an adequate sample size, is there a reason? Was the sample representative? Is there validity evidence of the instruments or whatever they're using to collect information? So I think it's kind of like the rigor part of what they're doing.
I guess one of the things that I see as an editor-in-chief is when people don't like the response of reviewers. And I get someone, and this doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while, that wants to argue about it. And I'm like, sorry, the decision has been made. This is how we're going about it. We're all in this together to try to get the best material out. And that's why there's peer review. So take the comments when people give you comments on reviews, and you don't have to agree with all of them. You can disagree, but disagree in a nice way. Give the reasoning as to why you made a certain decision or designed something in a certain way, but really don't start arguing about it like that. That's not going to get you anywhere. That's just common stuff. But every once in a while that happens, and that just gets to me, because the process is the process, so that you have peers to look at it. It's not just one person making a decision, it's multiple people looking at it.
Yeah, I think that point is really huge, is just be nice. Like at the end of it, be nice. As a reviewer, you can be strict, but you don't want to be the, for a typical reviewer too, that everyone avoids, where it's just your paper is garbage. It shouldn't be written, right? It should be, imagine someone else on the other end of that, when you're writing a review, that they're going to see this and they put a lot of time into it. And the reviewers on the other end, they put a lot of time in their reviews. Like, we all do this as totally free work that we could be doing a bunch of other things instead of sitting in a dark room working through reviews. And that's done with the intention of, trying to strengthen the other person's paper. Like, most reviewers are really out there to try to make the paper better, or to help make sure that it's in the right journal, and that you can give feedback to the editor to decide what's a better journal if that's not the right one. So I think just kind of being conscious of that. And so I'm always thoughtful that even when I don't at all agree with the reviewers' comments, is that I appreciate what they were trying to do. And I just defend why. I say, here's why it wouldn't work in this case, but I still think it's a really good paper, no bias, and that's why it should be published here. So let's say it goes through, and it goes across the desk, and they say, you know what, this is not the, I don't think that this is the right fit, or, in some form of it, we're not going to publish your paper. How do you handle that?
You're asking me that, Mike?
Any of the above, but you can, if you like.
So, a letter will go out to anybody that submitted a manuscript, and it'll go out at one of 2 points typically if we're not going to accept a paper. And one could be right at the very beginning. I read it and it really doesn't meet the finer criteria, and I say, I'm sorry. Or something else is just published on it, and they may not know because it's in process. And then the second stage would be after it's been out for multiple different kind of peer reviews or revisions, and it still just doesn't meet the mark. And then, another letter is sent out that's typically drafted by the decision editors, and it explains, why the paper wasn't accepted. But that's the process, and I think pretty similar for all journals. I don't know if you guys have seen something else other places.
I think the trick with this is when it's rejected, take the comments, use it to change, and resubmit quickly.
Absolutely. So being conscious of the time, let's maybe if everyone could share like one last pearl or take-home point that we can all use to work on our next project or manuscript. And maybe Jamie, do you want to start this one off?
I guess my biggest take home is just make it a priority. I think, again, if you want to do this and you want to do this well and you want to be successful, it needs to be a priority in your professional life. So block out that time, protect that time, and make it happen.
I think for me, it is the team or the people I come up with all kinds of ideas, but I often need someone else to say, hey, that one's going to work, or this is the problem with that one. And really kind of having that team of people around me who are expert to help me be better.
Yeah, I say know when to let something go. Don't get too connected to something if it's not going to make it past the finish line for whatever reason. There's plenty of stuff out there to do, but if you get yourself into a hole and you just can't get out, sometimes you need to step away and start something else.
So many amazing points. And the last one I think is just think about our future of it. Try to collaborate, identify new people, mentor new people, and try to help to expand the group of our education researchers. So with that, I want to thank our amazing panelists for today. If anyone's interested in becoming a reviewer for AMENT, you can reach out to Susan Promise at spromise at pennstatehealth.psu.edu. It's also in the chat. And thank you all for attending today.